The further developed self, which rises to become a being for self, is master over the pure pathos of substance, over the objectivity of the light of sunrise, and knows that simplicity of truth as essential being, which does not have the form of contingent existence through an alien speech, knows it as the sure and unwritten law of the gods, a law that is everlasting and no one knows whence it came. Just as the universal truth, which was revealed by the divine light, has here withdrawn into the inner or nether world of being and is thus freed from the form of contingent existence, so, on the other hand, in the religion of art, because the shape of the God has taken on consciousness and hence individuality in general, the utterance peculiar to the God, who is the spirit of an ethical nation, is the oracle, which knows its particular affairs and what is advantageous concerning them. The universal truths, however, because they are known as that which possesses essential being, are claimed by conscious thought for itself, and their speech is no longer alien to it, but is its own. Just as that wise man of old searched in his own thought for what was good and beautiful, but left it to his daimon to know the petty contingent content of what he wanted to know, whether it would be good for him to keep company with this or that person, or good for one of his acquaintances to go on a journey, and similar unimportant things. In the same way, the universal consciousness draws knowledge of the contingent from birds or trees or the yeasty earth, the vapor from which deprives self-consciousness of its self-possession. For the contingent is something that is not self-possessed and is alien, and therefore the ethical consciousness lets itself settle such matters too, as by a throw of the dice, in an unthinking and alien manner. When the individual, by using his understanding, makes up his mind and after deliberation chooses what is advantageous for him, this self-determination is based on the specific nature of his particular character. This latter is itself contingent, and therefore knowledge supplied by the understanding as to what is advantageous for the individual is just such a knowledge as that of the oracles or of the lot. Only that he who questions the oracle or lot thereby expresses the ethical sentiment of indifference to what is contingent, while the former, on the other hand, treats what is intrinsically contingent as an important concern of his thinking and knowing. What is higher than both, however, is not only to make deliberation the oracle for a contingent action, but in addition to know that this deliberate action is itself something contingent on account of its connection with the particular aspect of the action and of its advantageousness. Paragraph 712 is a long one, and coming on the heels of paragraphs 710 and 711 before it, in which we had this explicit introduction of a new element, namely language, Sprache, right, for the revelation, the worship, the engagement with the divine. Coming on the heels of that, we would expect it to be consolidating those two and talking an awful lot about language. And language does figure into it, but not in quite as direct a way. Instead, what we get is this initial discussion of, what we can call the further developed self, and we'll get into that in just a moment. And then we have this kind of splitting, and we have a curious statement here following on the heels of 711, where he said, well, the oracle, that's another mode of language, but that's for, the older religious views. This is not quite as developed. Now suddenly the oracle comes back in for discussion and gets framed as something essential to the ethical nation, the sittliche Volk, that we've been unpacking in this. And it's worth reminding ourselves that here Hegel is not talking about the belief of the individual religious worshiper just by themselves, or even about necessarily we could call them great craftsmen of language. He does mention, Socrates in here, and he does also bring up Sophocles, Antigone, but it's really more about the individual within a matrix as a linguistic being, and the God also coming into that. Now, last paragraph, we found out that the speech of the oracle is actually, in some respect, alien to its community. It's fremd, right? It's set apart. And now we're finding that there's more going on, but the oracle is still being used kind of as a foil. We not only have the consideration of the ethical nation and its oracle, but also of Socrates and his daimon, which we'll get into in just a bit, and then an acting and deliberating person who is motivated by their character, by advantage. And in all of this, we have this splitting taking place, or at least distinction, between the contingent, and this is kind of a strange contingent, we'll talk about in a moment, and then what we'd expect to see instead of the contingent would be the necessary, but instead we get the universal. So what's going on here? Well, to begin with, contingent, as we're going to talk about a little bit more, is zufällige in German. It's not another word that we often translate as contingency or arbitrariness, Willkürlichkeit, right? When something is being determined, arbitrary, we've actually lost the Latinate sense of it. Arbitrium is like choice, and an arbiter is a chooser, and so there's a sense of contingency resulting from the choices of other people, whereas the zufällige, things just happen to be that way. We could actually call it more random, or just the way things, literally the way things fall out, right? Rather than necessarily being that way because somebody chose them. Although there's often a lot of connection. I mean, Aristotle points this out in the Metaphysics, that chance itself, or touche, what we think of as randomness, isn't really all that random. There's just causes going on that we don't fully understand, and that some of them may in fact stem from the choices or the faculty of choice, the proeresis, of people who were involved, right? But let's put that aside for a moment. And let's start at the start. So he says, the further developed self. Okay, so we want to pause right there, right? Further developed, weitergebildete self, right? So bilden is not just developing, but also education. It can apply to all sorts of cultivation. This is at a later stage in the development of the religion mediated through art. So the further developed self that we're dealing with here, which gives, he says, which rises to become a being for self. And notice that being for self here is being portrayed not just as, it's a feature of consciousness. We all take positions on ourselves. It's being portrayed as a kind of achievement, a kind of development at this stage. And now he says a few interesting things. It is master over the pure pathos of substance, over the objectivity of the light of sunrise. So let's pause there. Master. Is this in German Herr? No, it's Meister. A term that we've seen being used a lot in this section. One who understands and can, in a craft-like way, make something occur. It would be the, sort of like the architecton in Greek, the person who can dispose of these matters. So the master of the pure pathos, the pure, when we say pathos, very often we think feeling, but pathos comes from the Greek pathein, to suffer, the thing that just is imposed upon us. The pure pathos of substance. Substances just wind up being the way that they are. Kind of zufällige in a way, even though they have essentiality as well. Over the objectivity of the light of sunrise, what's that a reference to? Well, that came up in the previous paragraph, and that's come up in other parts. The light of sunrise is great, right? But it doesn't tell us an awful lot. It's not as developed. So he says, it knows that simplicity of truth as essential being, which does not have the form of contingent existence through an alien speech. Okay, so this is important. Knows the simplicity of truth, which is going to be by itself and in itself, right? And knows it as an essential being which does not have the form of contingent existence through an alien speech. How does it know it? Here's where the Sophocles Antigone reference comes up. And we should remind ourselves, okay, what, if we've forgotten, what was going on in Sophocles Antigone besides all the cool stuff about, like, it's the conclusion of the whole Oedipus sequence, and, there's all these family dynamics going on. That's all great stuff. And we've got the, miserable figure of Creon as well. And now we're getting to something. Creon represents the law of the city. And man, does that city of Thebes need some law. It needs a ruler who is there in the midst of the city saying, listen, things have been messed up. I mean, we almost got conquered by one of our own citizens who went off and brought a whole bunch of Argives here to try to kill us all and, take over the city. And we've got, Oedipus who came in and killed the previous king and married his mom and sired these 4 messed up kids who are both his kids and his brothers and sisters. And wow, what a confusing lot this is. If there was any city that needed the human law front and center, represented in Creon, well, it was Thebes after Oedipus managed to make a total mess of it, and his kids too. On the other hand, Antigone claims to be following, not the representative of, but following a law that's a higher law when she goes to bury her brother who was a traitor against his own city. So what is this higher law? This is the unwritten law, the law that resides within our hearts, our minds. This is one of the origins of the idea in the West of natural law, right? So here Hegel calls it the sure and unwritten law of the gods, a law that is everlasting and no one knows whence it came. So that's a quote from Sophocles Antigone. An unwritten law of the gods, a sure law of the gods, a law that's everlasting. 3 very important qualities, right? It's never going to be changed. It's something we can be confident in. It's not written because it doesn't have to be written. We can feel our way or think our way to it. And no one knows whence it came. Did the gods themselves, at some point in time make it up? Well, we don't have a record of that. And maybe it is binding even on them. So this is important. This is what the further developed self is getting to know. And this is something that we can read into further developments, as Hegel is going to do, very, very suggestively in this paragraph. So let's go on and see what he says. Just as the universal truth, which was revealed by the divine light, the sunlight, right, has withdrawn into the inner or nether world of being, and thus is freed from the form of contingent existence. So coming back to this law, right? It's not going to change. It's not needing to be written down because it's not something, contingent that can be changed later on down the line, like, say, written constitutions can with amendments, right? So he goes and he says, on the other hand, in the religion of art, because the shape, the gestalt of the God has taken on consciousness. Going back, right? We had the God as essentially like the statue, and it could represent the God, but the statue didn't have consciousness. Consciousness of the God is able to arise through language, through Sprache. And language belongs to a community. It's not something that just originates by itself. It's something that has a back and forth and is intergenerational. So the God takes on consciousness and hence individuality. Now notice this, individuality in general. Isn't that kind of a oxymoron there? Well, no. There's a certain sense in which we use the word individual, right? Einzeln or Einzelnheit, and that is general, isn't it? Because I have my individuality, you have your individuality. You know, the guy walking down the street eating a donut or something like that, whistling a tune to himself, different individuality. That could be you, of course. Imagine you're walking along, hearing this, and you're eating a donut and whistling to yourself and like, oh my God, that's me, right? Anyway, we can talk about individuality in general, and the gods have that. If we think about the Greek gods for a moment, right? What is Demeter, right? She represents something, but she's also a character in these different literary works that we still have. Last time I brought up, 2 paragraphs ago, commenting on that, I brought up one of the hymns, in this case to Athena, but there's hymns to Demeter as well. And so those are literary productions. So it is possible to be individuality in general or have that. So he goes on and he says, the utterance peculiar to the God who is the spirit, the Geist, of an ethical nation, right, a sittliche Volk, is the oracle. Now, why the revaluation of the oracle? Last time he was like, the oracle, not quite as developed a mode of language. It's alien to its people. Now he's actually saying, so the God can talk through the oracle. What God is he thinking about in particular? Well, Apollo, of course, right? Because he's going to mention the Pythian interpreter in just a bit here. But he says the oracle, there's a certain helpfulness. It knows the contingent, right? He says it knows its particular affairs, the particular affairs of the ethical nation, and what is advantageous concerning them. What is nützlich, right? Or it knows Nützlichkeit, what is needful, what is helpful, what is advantageous, what's good for you, It's sort of like knowing somebody and their dietary tastes. Or whatever allergies they have. If you know that somebody has a peanut allergy, don't give them peanut butter cookies, right? And don't keep any peanut butter around. And if you know that they really like spaghetti and meatballs, and not just store-bought meatballs, but, homemade meatballs with fresh garlic and parsley and all that other kind of stuff, and it's a special occasion. Well, you make them that. That's Nützlichkeit. That's advantage right there, right? If you know that somebody doesn't like their curry too spicy, or they like it super spicy or whatever. These are all things that would fall under Nützlichkeit, and this for the God could apply to like the history of the ethical nation, the relationships between the various ruling class people and all of their clients. It could apply to the geography. It could apply to anything that you want. There are contingent features that need to be taken into account. So he says the God knows what is advantageous concerning these. But, on the other side, the universal truths. Now notice here the plural. Before, we were talking about the further developed self knows the simplicity of truth, singular, right? Wahrheit. Now we have universal truths, plural. And this is important because anytime that we have a plurality of truths, we're going to have the dynamic that we've seen so many times before where maybe we have to center on one of them and then what about the others? Or we have to think about, can these be in contradiction to each other? But they are universal truths. So he says, the universal truths, because they are known as that which possesses essential being, that which is not just contingent, but has essential being, something that is going to be lasting. Again, we go back to the law, right? The unwritten law of the gods, a law that is everlasting and no one knows where it came. It's sure we can rely upon it. So he says, they're claimed by conscious thought. Now, conscious thought, wissende denken. Conscious, yeah, okay, that works. We might, be thinking about like consciousness and self-consciousness. Here it's more like thought that is actually knowing things. There's lots of different thoughts that we're not knowing something directly through, right? But this is we might call it close to conceptual thought. And he goes on and he says, their speech is no longer alien to it, but is its own, right? So their speech is no longer alien to itself. It's no longer alien to the ethical people. It's no longer alien, I suppose you could say, to the God. But there's a sort of consolidation going on here, a unification. And both of these sides are very important. Now, if we look at the next example that he brings up, Socrates, we get to see both of these sides at work. And I think this helps us better understand what Hegel is trying to get at here. So he says, just as that wise man of old searched in his own thought for what was good and beautiful. Now, that's an interesting point. Did he search in his own thought for what was good and beautiful? Definitely. As a matter of fact, we know that Socrates would withdraw into himself away from the contingent, mundane world of existence. For example, when he was on military duty or in the symposium, when he's walking on his way to the dinner party that he's invited Aristobulus to crash, he stops and he's like in his own head, as we say, thinking about the good, the beautiful, the true, these sort of transcendent entities, beings, Wesenheit, right? We call them essentialities. So that's one side of Socrates. But he also does seek that out in other people, too, doesn't he? Through dialectic, through engaging in dialogue with them. Sometimes he manages to reach some sort of useful conclusion, sometimes not. But a lot of people learn on the way. On the other side, Socrates has this special thing that some people call his sign, some people call, some sort of entity. Some people have interpreted as he was epileptic, but that's probably just a silly, itself very contingent explanation. And he calls it a daimon. And what is a daimon in ancient Greek? They're not quite gods. They're not human beings. They're something that passes in between, right? The daimones. Later on, this gets turned by Christian authors into demons, but in the ancient, for the ancient Greeks, and really continuing on through Platonic philosophy, they were neither particularly bad or good. And as a matter of fact, some of them were quite good. So in some respect, they're a little bit more like angels than demons. But they would do things. They were intercessors in a certain way. And Socrates only acts in a negative way. It gives him a little, kind of zing that he can't quite adequately explain. It doesn't tell him anything in words, but it steers him away from doing things. So when he's about to make his... He doesn't really plead for his life. He's actually making an argument at his trial. He'll say, my daimon did not tell me to not come here, so that's why I'm here, So things must be okay. So the contingent, what is useful for us, the daimon indicates that to Socrates. Hegel says he left it to his daimon to know the petty contingent content of what he wanted to know, the zufällige Inhalt, right? So on the one hand, we've got the universal and seeking the universal. On the other hand, we have what you need to live in the world, the contingent. And both of these are important. So he says, examples of this, whether it would be good for him to keep company with this or that person, good for one of his acquaintances to go on a journey, and similar unimportant things. And there's another important aspect of the contingent that Hegel talks about here, not in terms of Socrates, but again, more in terms of the ethical nation and its God, content, or signs. He says that in the same way the universal consciousness draws knowledge of the contingent from what? Birds. Watching how birds fly, or cutting them open and looking at their entrails, or trees, or the yeasty earth, the vapor from which deprives self-consciousness of its self-possession. What's he talking about there? The oracle at Pythia, where this, priestess would sit there and sniff in the fumes of something and get high and then say the stuff for the gods, right? That is a contingent manner of gaining universal truths. And so she says, he says, the contingent is something that is not self-possessed and is alien, and therefore the ethical consciousness lets itself settle such matters too, as by a throw of the dice, in an unthinking and alien manner. And then now he talks about the acting individual, the acting person. When the individual, by using his understanding, Verstand, makes up his mind, and after, literally chooses, wählt, right? And after deliberation, Überlegung, consideration, weighing things, chooses what is advantageous for him, this self-determination is based on the, specific nature of his particular character, he says. It could be all sorts of other things too, circumstances, relationships, but particular character. Now, this latter, the character of a person, he says, is itself contingent, zufällige. Did I choose to have the kind of character that I have? I mean, you could say, well, to the degree that you've been building and modifying your character over the years, yes, but you start out with the basic building blocks that you get. I am always going to struggle more with some things than some other people will. I will always be at some advantages over other people. There are going to be some things that I will be interested in that other people won't be, and vice versa, and that's part of our character, which is contingent. And so he goes on and he says, knowledge supplied by the understanding as to what is advantageous for the individual is just such a knowledge as that of the oracles or the lot. Now, that comes back to something that is itself a contingent piece of information, but would probably help out anybody who's confused about, roll of the dice or the lot. Not all oracles necessarily spoke or speak, because there are people still using them today, in quite so direct ways, a priestess sniffing in fumes and then uttering the language of the gods. Many of them proceed by rolling dice or casting nuts on a screen, or by taking yarrow stalks and throwing them down and checking that out, or flipping coins, and we could go on and on and on about the many different ways of divination, which then are interpreted and applied to the contingent circumstances. So in a similar way, the acting person does this as well. He says, just as a kind of knowledge of that of the oracles or the lot, only that he who questions the oracle or lot thereby expresses the ethical sentiment of indifference to what is contingent. When you go to an oracle or lot, you are allowing it to talk about the contingent, but you also want these universal truths. You're trying to get at something important, right? So he says, the former, on the other hand, treats what is intrinsically contingent as an important concern of his thinking and knowing. Then he concludes with this really interesting statement. What is higher than both is not only to make deliberation the oracle for a contingent action, right? So deliberation, considering things on our part, we treat that part of ourself as if it is an oracle. But in addition, to know that this deliberate action, right, this action using Überlegung, is itself something contingent on account of its connection with a particular aspect of action and its advantageousness. So there's sort of like doing things at a higher level, but still in terms of contingency. And, again, we have the both sides here. We have contingency being involved. We also have we might call it hyper-conscious or meta-conscious self, realizing what is actually going on through the modes in which it is comporting itself. So a lot happening in this paragraph. As I mentioned, not a lot of discussion specifically about language like in the last two paragraphs, but we're going to get more of that as time goes on.